Day 2, the Value of Life Measurement States and Implications Conference. I hope that you all had a great time last night at dinner. My name is Megan Ormond. I'm Assistant Professor in Cultural Geography here at Wageningen University. And I'm also a member of the Center for Space, Place and Society's Steering Committee. It's an honor and a pleasure for me today to be able to introduce today's keynote speaker, Annemarie Mol. Annemarie is Professor of Anthropology of the Body at the University of Amsterdam. The winner of the Constantijn and Christiane Huygens grant from the Dutch National Research Council, the NWO, in 1990 to study differences in medicine. She was awarded a European Research Council Advanced Grant in 2010 to study the eating body in Western practice and theory. She later went on to be awarded in 2012 the Spinoza Prize, which is the most prestigious award in Dutch science, recognizing outstanding, groundbreaking scholarship. In her work, Professor Mol has helped to develop post-actor network theory and feminist understandings of science, technology, and society. In her earlier work, she explored the performativity of healthcare practices, arguing that realities are generated within those practices. And she noted that since practices differ, so too do realities. As she observed, the body is multiple. It's more than one, but it's also less than many, since the different versions of the body overlap in different kinds of practices in healthcare. As part of this, she's also developed the notion of ontological politics, arguing that since realities or the conditions of possibility vary between practices, they are not given, but they're open to change. Some of her most recent work has focused on what we might learn from eating practices and the more than human relationships that they foster. And I think that this work speaks particularly to many of those in the Wageningen context. And I'd like to specifically point out a paper that was published in EPD a couple of years ago. Right? Sorry? Yeah, a couple of years back. In Geoform, that looks specifically at this question of omega-3, so the human consumption of omega-3, but where does it come from? And how do we understand how it gets assimilated? So this kind of question of thinking about more than human relationships is quite an exciting one. Professor Mol is the author of multiple articles and books on these different topics that I've mentioned, including the books, of course, The Body Multiple, Ontology and Medical Practice, and Logic of Care, Health and the Problem of Patient Choice. I am most honored today to be able to introduce Professor Annemarie Mol. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thanks a lot, Megan. The difficult thing of being introduced is that after that I can only disappoint. So I don't particularly like to, how to say this, be given praise before I do my act. Because the question today, since we're here, is not what I did there, but what I'll do for you here. So thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this great event. Yesterday I heard a lot of really inspiring papers, and I look forward to those I'll be hearing in the days to come. And I'll try to contribute to the event by giving my talk today, which I think is a nice complementary talk to the talk we had yesterday, where Catherine Gibson gave us a very broad idea of how do we understand the kind of how do we grapple with the kind of realities we live with. I'm going to focus very specifically and in a very it doesn't work. The microphone doesn't work. Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
It's on? It's on. It's better like this. Right? Thanks very much for pointing it out. Good. So I'll take a very thin, specific line through ways of doing research about value, and I'll ask where questions. So if I speak, I have the voice. But my voice is backed up by a lot of other people with whom I had the honor to work in the last 2 years. I will not read all out their name, but we call ourselves the Eating Bodies team. Even if some of them now work in other places, they're still the team. It's a bit like a family. You can enter, but you cannot leave. And even if some of the people here are no longer are not particularly working on shitting, but on eating, but on shitting. I have learned I shouldn't use that word in English, but it's what it is. Good. And on everything that passes afterwards. And some of them are here. you can speak to them afterwards and blame them for my mistakes. Good. Okay, we're talking about values and valuing life in this conference, and I'm going to do that in a specific kind of way. There is a classic understanding, let me call it a classic understanding. This is this kind of rhetoric. You point out the classic understanding so that you can contrast yourself against it. So this is the contrast. The classic understanding is that things or situations have a value, and that you can then wonder whether it can be measured or whether it cannot be measured. Now, the icon for that at the moment is the Great Barrier Reef, and it is being valued, and it's even being valued at the moment in economic ways, and some of you know a lot more about this than I do, but you can see how that kind of valuing is then part of a way of doing protection, of which you then can, of at least pointing out that this is a reality there, and translating into economic language so that people who speak only economic language can understand. With all the pros and cons that can be discussed, but that is all part of the idea that things may have a value. What comes with that kind of thing, things have a value, is that people would have a value. So people would have a value, and then you can discuss where people get their value from, whether they get it from education, religion, or so-called culture, or whether they don't have values anymore these days. And the presumption in that kind of talk, the basic presumption, is that acts would be based on values. And I've got another evoking. My images, by the way, are evocations. They're not representations. They're meant to give you some friction and stuff to think with. Good. So here's one that I found on the net. What all children must learn the value of having values. And so there is this thing that people have values and things have values. Now, one of the ways of leaving that whole trajectory is to do the verb thing, to say no, to say, well, maybe we can also approach this type of reality through the question of valuing as a practice, where values are not things that are inherent in either things or objects or situations, and they're not inherent in subjects either, but they are being done in practices. Now, this is the classic practice turn trick, is to then say what we can do also is investigated practices where valuing is being done. Now again, I'll show you a few evocations. On the top there's a Brazilian woman practically practicing the valuing a mango. So you can see her appreciating as a kind of way of, this is doing valuing. So it's a different kind of doing valuing as the measurement one. The second photo you have here is of somebody measuring the land. That is another way of doing value. And the down one is, again, I found on the net, and to be honest, is flooding in Bangladesh, where you see the valuing of the children, how being carried in with the cooking pots. Both important things to carry with you, of course, if you need to do rescuing work. Good. If you start to study doing valuing rather than values, the objects and the subjects do not precede these practices of valuing. They're part of what's being done in the practice. It's not that they're just like God created man on day 1 or on day 6, they're created there and there. Of course, they emerge out of earlier histories and earlier practices, but they take a specific shape they have in valuing practice as part of that practice. And you could say they are performed, which is one way of expressing it, or enacted as part of these practices. And I don't very much hang on the terms, I'll talk about that in a bit. The question is, I really think one of the important things I want to get as a second message out to you today is we should not fix our terms in any sense of the word. We should play with our terms, we should work with our terms. So, and adapt the terms in this where and here or that way, but I'll come back to that. Good. If you start to study how valuing is done in practices, it's done along with facting. This word doesn't exist in English, but I think if, as non-native speakers, which many of us are, we do so much our best to speak the imperialist language, which is fine, that allows us to talk to each other. I couldn't talk all the languages assembled in this room, neither could we talk to each other, so we speak with this language. But if we do, then let's mess with it. And the prize for the imperialist language is that we can all play with that. For us non-native speakers speaking it is that we're allowed to play with it. Of course, in a way that it's still understandable to the others, because that was the point of speaking. So I want to introduce the word facting. And facting is like valuing. It's an analogy. Just as people are doing, or not just people, as in practices valuing is being done, facting is being done. Some things are turned into fact. So I give you again two evocative pictures. What you can see in both pictures, can you see them clearly? Well, that one's not very clear because it's so foggy. So this is both bicycling in China. But at the same time, you can see what the facting, what is bicycling. And what is good about it, the valuing, is in both pictures very different. So these are both practices of biking. So there is a resonance and a commonality and an overlap. But in the one, it's ostensibly you go to work and it's messy and you put on something against all the pollution. And the other, it's sort of a romantic, displaced English celebration of nature, quote unquote. The outdoors, where biking is suddenly part of being the way of being part of the landscape, as the English taught us, and of enjoying through sport and through the vivid body the wonders of whatever it is where you are. So in different practices, biking may be facted different and valued differently. And this goes for all the kind of other things that we may all study in our various practices we study. Now, this whole idea of studying valuing in practice, it's always good to realize, and that's part of the here or there questions, is to not pretend or think that this is something that I or we or some larger group that we are a part of are inventing on the spot. In very many disciplines, this shift from nouns to verb is happening. It's not just happening we of course, there's nobody else listening, is there? Mm-hmm. So we can pretend ourselves to be sort of academic avant-garde who is inventing all kinds of new things. But oftentimes, if you think that, if you look around in other disciplines, similar things are going on. Huh? So let's start with one of the pet enemies in the room, which is economics, in its traditional guise. Well, that has made this same shift. I mean, in the classic idea of price in economics, there was this idea that goods have intrinsic value. And economics has made the shift to understanding price as emergent in processes of valuation. So this whole thing that you can shift from an inherent value to a process of valuing the economists have done that in their own way. But ecology, to take one of the favorite disciplines in the room, has made a similar move. And it's good to see these analogies. I think it's always good to keep on looking in a sort of, how to say that, curious and invested way into all these disciplines. So you could have a certain version of biology in which you could have worth attached to individual organisms. And this is one of the things that still emerges in some kind of, in some versions of nature protection, where there is this love of the organism, and that's especially for lovable organisms, the elephant or the panda, generally not for the worm or the malaria mosquito. Good. So you can have this idea of worth in the organism, or, which is far more prominent in ecology for a long time already, you can see the different creatures as valuing each other, so to speak, in different ways. So the grass can be food for the cow, or it can feed on the soil nutrients. But in ecology, the value of what creatures make each other be may also be competitors. So it's either the sheep or the cow that gets the grass, to make it a bit too simple, or it's either the fox or the weasel that gets the rabbit. And also in ecology, you have creatures valuing each other as a potential dwelling place. So the tree is for the bird, the dwelling place. I mean, I'm telling you nothing new, but what I try to show here is that this whole idea of value is around, and we pick it up in the kind of interdisciplines that most of us are working in, either political ecology, social geography. You can have all kinds of names, material semiotics, I haven't put it here, all kinds of names in which we we work in these spaces between the material and the social. By the way, just parenthesis for the geographers in the room, I'm quite stunned that in geography this whole idea of more than human geography has come up, let's say 15 years ago, as something new, because what I historically always thought is that geography, in the course of the 20th century, you had the split up between the natural and the social, and that geography escaped that until very long. And that the whole idea that you would split the social and the material in geography came only up somewhere in the 80s to be crushed again in the 90s, to be a bit blunt about the history. So for me, the originality of geography was always that it was much better than sociology in that it had the materialities there. So the problem is not this maybe the whole word human geography. Don't use that. If you have social geography, you have already this. Well, that's of course in itself. But maybe just say geography. Then you're writing the earth, literally, and writing the earth has already the materialities in it. So this is a sideline, but good. Good. In our kind of interdisciplines, I think one of the strengths is that we don't have, since it's interdisciplines and the knowledge circulates between them, what we can do is study value in specific complex cases. And the complex here allures to both the fact that they have the social and the material, or the living and the non-living, or the human and I don't know what else you can say against it. I so hate non-human because it's such a weird category, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so here you can have the complex cases of value that you study one by one. So what you do in what I do, or what some of us do if we study value in practices, is that we bracket the question, can we measure the value of life? We don't answer it, neither with a yes or with a no, but we practice it, and we bracket it, and we say, listen, this measuring of the value of life is being done all around us. There are all kinds of places where this is done. Let's take one step back and wonder how it's done. So rather than, can it be done? Well, it can be done, it can be, people are doing it. How is it done? What is the goods and bads of how they're doing it? And that's not to forever stay retreated, but it is a good move to escape from this, can it be done or not, which is in a gut sense always a positive question, positive to this question, because then you think there is value that can be measured. No, how are value in practices taking shape and what's going along with them? You see the lady there is actually valuing food. Is it safe or not? I mean, that's what she's doing. And I can say she cannot do it, but she earns a living by it. So the proposition I make is that of understanding what these practices may achieve and may not achieve. Now, of course, once you ask that kind of question, as we know, there are endless possible questions that may be asked, like what is required to do this kind of measuring of value, what follows from it, for better or worse, what kind of objects and subjects are enacted in those practices, but also what kind of goals or desires, and not unimportant, what kind of blanks, so what is not done, what is forgotten or bracketed in value practices. And I'll give a few other preliminaries before I start on my where question, just to show that I really know that the where question is not the only one to ask, but to widen a bit where we are. So one of the things that is really important once you step back and say how is value being done is to realize that a lot of things are not being valued, are not regarded or attended to through the question of value. Let's say if you have toxicity in a surrounding, this can only be valued if there are measurement techniques. So if there is some kind of toxic substance that nobody has a measurement technique for, then it will not be valued. So then that's the risk of my strategy of, not just mine, but the strategy I propose here of taking a step back. That if I take a step back and how are things valued, and things are simply forgotten or not attended to, either because there's no techniques, or there's no interest, or there's nobody pushing them, or the people pushing them are a tiny social protest group somewhere, but they have no money, then putting things on the agenda for being valued is not obvious, and it requires attention and technology. And an easy and good, easy to say but not to do example of that is what we've seen in how feminists have made, let's say, rape valued as rape. let's say 40 years ago, rape within marriage was an unrecognized category that couldn't be valued because that marriage was a terrain where one had sex. So to value some practices as rape has been a social struggle, has been a lot of work. And interestingly, and it's still a lot of work in many parts of the world, including here. And you can go into the question what goes into that work, and part of what goes into that particular work is not measurement techniques, but just recognizing that there might be such a thing as women's sexual pleasure. So it's not just about recognizing suffering, it's about recognizing pleasure. Good, this is a completely different story. But I hint at it because it's a good story to realize that value and practices are not just given with all kind of realities. Putting them into place is part of a social problem. Another big question is, what are the effects of value? Because you may have a big meeting. I very much like this picture of the meeting, where people talk, and then they may measure something, or they may send out others to do research. And as you know, for those of you who have any inkling about any policy process, if you are part of a policy process and you want to postpone a decision, you get researchers in to do measurements for you and to do kind of things, and that's a way of not doing things. And as we know, other kind of valuing things have performative effects even before they have effects. Like, we all know this from practice, like the kind of assessment of our work. As soon as you have Google Scholar, it's possible to shift the valuation of the work from how many articles have you written to how many citations do you have. And then, because of course academics are clever, they're going to shift their strategy from an extra publication to writing one that gets cited, etc., and so on, before even their bosses ask them how much have been cited. So these practices may have their own performative effect. And then that falls back to what I said earlier. I don't think we should fix our terms. And I think in relation to this whole field of studying value, it's interesting to consider other possible verbs. And I just put out a few here: measuring, assessing, appreciating, qualifying, tasting, judging, critiquing, praising, and caring, as they all do slightly different work, or they can be used to do slightly different work for us. Words don't act. Forget it. Things don't act either. That's a liberal fantasy, but good. People don't act either, by the way. Good. In network, things get done, is what I would say. But good. All these words would resonate with different other words and carry different baggage with them. And let's say I put a little photo of the judge. That's a very particular kind of assessing values, because what judges are asked to do in a typical juridical system is do judgmental values. So it's something has or has not been done right or wrong. And that is a very different kind of way of valuing of, for instance, a cook. Because if a cook thinks that the soup doesn't taste good, she adds a bit of pepper. And so in that kind of practice, valuing is part of caring or improving things. While a judge is not going to improve there and then the deed that she or he is judging, that has been done already, it's in the past. So all these kinds of valuing techniques are very different. All that said, this was still all preliminaries. I want to now shift to where questions. And the inscribed enemy of my talk is the generalization. Now, what is a generalization? That is the moment that a way of valuing, a mode of valuing that has developed here in one particular situation and occasion is put to work there. So it's made to shift. And this, again, is not in general bad, but in many specific cases that has very weird and counterproductive effects, and I'll give you 4. And I'll start with the word, the quality of life, because that was sort of buzzing through some of the versions of the calls for paper I saw. Now, where I first met the quality of life, and this is one of the important social sites where it emerged, is in the evaluation of cancer treatments, and this was in the 70s, the 1970s. So the cancer treatments were coming up, plus the idea that you had to do clinical trials to evaluate medical treatments. And the classic first way of evaluating was survival. And that, of course, makes sense in something like pneumonia, which you either survive or you die. So you measure survival. The problem with cancer is that the treatments are so often so heavy on people that if you have a heavy treatment and you still die, you might as well want to go without the treatment, or many people did. So the articulation of this desire that treatment is only relevant if it really adds something to a good life was expressed by very starting patient movements, but also especially carried by nurses into the world through this word quality of life. The point is not quantity, another year, the point is quality. Is it worth living that year? And what was brought in nursing studies and also by sociologists studying patients and by patients themselves is that quality depends on their own terms. What is quality for one person may be very different than for the other. It depends on the specific situation where you are. If, let's say, if you're just about to be a grandmother and you can last 4 more months to see your grandchild, you might have a different sort of situation that you're in than if you just finished all kind of things and you have the feeling, I'm done, it's okay, etc. and so on. So the whole idea was that the quality of life had to be attended to, and that in addition to that, what mattered to people themselves had to be attended to. But what happened? Given the research style around, quality of life was quickly quantified. And because if quantity of life would not have to be measured, then quality of life had to be measured. So all kinds of people started to make these kind of, the questions don't matter for now, these kind of papers with all kind of questions, and then you can score from 1 to 5. And that was a way to get quality of life into the consideration of the therapy. But what happened, of course, is that the researchers provide the terms. They set the questions, and they give the grading. So this whole idea that what matters to life should be asked to the person, what matters to you, disappeared behind this kind of 5-point scale. And so what was at stake in life, quality, was very quickly solidified in fixed terms and linear scales. What also happens, what you see happening when this quality of life things travel, not necessarily in cancer treatments, but in all kind of other ways, that if people are asked, what is the quality of your life, did they think, many people, that depends, this is very interesting who does that or not, but in a kind of modernist setting, people think that the quality of life depends on themselves. So if you would ask me what is the quality of my life, and I would say it's miserable, you would say, let's sit down, what are you going to do about it? And so many people take themselves to be subjects of their life, and they will answer the quality of my life is an 8, because despite all my troubles, I make something good out of it. So this whole idea that with quality of life you could assess the troubles of people is disappeared behind this self-assessment in which with quality of life people do not just assess the circumstances in which they find themselves, but also what they themselves make of the circumstances. That completely disappears. Good. Terms like this travel, and interestingly, quality of life is also the buzzword of the university that hosts us. I am no means going to critique the university that hosts us. So in the mission statement of the University of Wageningen, it says that Wageningen is for quality of life. And I think, actually, I really admire this, because I think it has been a very clever compromise in the university between those who do factism and those who do functionalism. But at the same time enroll them in the whole idea that it's not just about facts, or about being functional, but that there should be something good. So it's a way of celebrating the good, whatever that may be. And it's also, I think, a clever way of holding disciplines together and different ambitions, because the biochemist might have a different ambition than the cultural geographer, although they could, of course, collaborate. But to hold all these ambitions, intention, quality of life, apparently functions greatly, and it might be interesting for a nice master project for somebody who wants a job elsewhere afterwards, to study what the goods and bads of this quality of life notion might be. Good. My second example. Independence. Now, independence is a great liberal good. We're all in favor of independence, especially in the rehabilitation clinic. Independence is a buzzword, and this is work of Rita Stucka, who did a PhD, and I published this independence paper with Rita and with Chan and Suirstad, who was the other supervisor. So I've given 2 pages now, something we worked on for a month. So we can get more and more condensed with these things. Anyway, so Rita did fieldwork in the rehabilitation clinic, and one of the things she found is that traditionally in the clinic, they had, this was people who are in a rehabilitation clinic, because most of them, because they had what is called in medical parlance a cerebrovascular accident. So they have a bleeding in their head, and sort of part of their body doesn't function anymore, but this can sometimes be partially regained. So the question is, with a lot of physical therapy, how much can it be regained? And the goal is independence, meaning something like, well, that's partly contested what it means. Huh? Does it mean that you can dress yourself, or is it okay if somebody else dresses you, but you can go to a meeting and have your neighborhood meeting, etc., and so on. So this is contested between patient movements and within clinics. But what within clinics, for the purpose of being practical, they have made is an instrument of measuring this, the FIM instrument. TM, of course, it had been patented, or how to say this, registered, trademark, but that is another question. Good. So you had this scale of independence that was made to map the condition of the person. So what you do is you have Mrs. So-and-so coming in the first instance, she had her brain thing here, and she cannot move her right hand. So you can see if she learns to move it better or worse, or to which extent. You can ask her, does she want to bath herself, does she want to brush her teeth, and gradually over the weeks or the months of the rehabilitation, you can see to which extent she regains independence. So that was what the tool was for, also because it's of course a good communication thing between the different professionals who work with one patient. So it's okay, it's a clinical tool to adapt treatment, because if you see that her arm really makes no progress, her right arm, you can think, okay, we learn her to compensate with the left arm, etc., and so on. Now, this measurement tool was then turned and used not to evaluate patients, but to evaluate treatments. So if you have 2 competing treatments, or 2 ways of treating a person, you can then say, let's see which of them measured with this scale gives most independence. And that is a typical sort of from here to there. It's a really different thing to evaluate a patient or to evaluate a treatment. Because what you do if you evaluate a treatment is that you, let's say, evaluate 50 patients with the tool, and think that you're not evaluating the patients, but that with evaluating 50 patients, you evaluate the treatment. One of the effects that that has is that the treatment, in the course of measuring it, should be held stable. So while the tool was made to adapt treatments, once it's used as a research tool, it stabilizes treatments. So the tool gets to do exactly the opposite of what it was meant to do, because it shifts from measuring patients to measuring treatments. And the valuing that was in the first instance, so the valuing of independence, was made to improve the treatment. Here is Mrs. So-and-so, and she's gradually learning to walk again, helped by 2 professionals. It was a tool for improving, becomes a tool for proving that treatment X or Z works. And I think this is one of the tragedies. I mean, this is just an example, but this is one of the tragedies of evaluation tools in healthcare, is that they have these weird effects of interfering in a practice, not just by evaluating the clinical practices, but by really changing the clinical practice and stabilizing treatments that used to be constantly tinkered with. There is this, I used the word doctored with, and I then was taught by native English speakers that it has a very negative connotation, doctoring, because it's a kind of adapting, but I think that that negative connotation is the problem, not the word. So this adapting of the doctoring was really one of the qualities of clinical medicine, and with this kind of evaluation it gets stabilized. More generally, I think one of the problems, not always and everywhere, but one of the potential drawbacks of evaluation tools is that they ask us to boast. So if at the end, rather than improve ourselves. So if at the end of the year, I would be asked by my boss, how have you been doing? I'm not supposed to say, well, this was a bad year and it didn't go very well, and I made a mess of it, and I'll try to be a bit better next year. you know it, you're not supposed to say that. But while it might often be really good to face that and to think, what should I improve to do better? What should I try to do better next year? The same goes in clinical and all kind of other things. No evaluation tools tend to ask you to praise yourself. And that, again, is a very counterproductive thing because they're introduced into practices to improve the practices. And they make us all boasting creatures rather than people who are trying to think how they could do better. And this goes for us as well, but it goes for this kind of practices. Good. Very different case. Food. What is enough food? Now, this is from research that I started and then was taken on board by Else Vogel, who pushed it a great deal. So again, it's a lot of shared work put into, this time, 3 slides. Yeah, so you can condense things, so this is what I'm here. So enough food, what is enough food? Now, in the early 20th century, that's where the first picture comes, this was assessed, and the research was paid for by employers. It wasn't called employers at that time, but good. And they wanted to assess the minimum wage that they could pay to their workers. And this because if you know how many calories they need, and then they can maybe feed a child or 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how generous the work or the payment might want to be. But anyway, so you could calculate scientifically the amount of food. So there was immediate worker protest because what you get there is a shift from demand to need. So the worker of the union may demand a certain amount of money, and the bosses may say, well, no, this says here very small, to decide the least a man can live on. So their purpose was have science calculate needs. So this is another classic way of how science may come in to shift the scene. But good. In that kind of setting, the first calorie measurements were done, and they were repeated and sort of refined in the Second World War by US Army healthcare researchers who had a real genuine problem that sometimes the soldiers they sent out to fight for against the Nazis here and against the Japanese in the Pacific, etc. around, that they didn't have enough food. And of course, a soldier with an empty belly is not going to work very well, so they had to calibrate, but if you overcharge a soldier, he has too much weight. So the idea was, how much do they need? And what was done is to do the research, it's good to have the precise setting of the research there, is that the researchers had a sort of completely secluded hotel, not like here where you can walk down into a village. But you can imagine one of these American states, I don't know which, where there's nothing, and for quite a distance, and you have one building, and you put a lot of, what they put there is a man who refused to be soldier. So they didn't get punishment, they became research subjects, which was quite a punishment because they didn't get enough food, and they had to work hard. And then the idea was, most of them lose weight, and what would be the exact calorie amount that they wouldn't lose weight? And that is how much food a person needs. Now, you all know by now, because it's on every package, that a man needs 2,500 kilocalories and a woman 2,000. I mean, good, we can unpack that as well. But you can see the setting where this made sense to invent that, but that fact is now on every package because it travels, and our various states use it to admonish us to not eat too much. So it has been shifted from a situation of caloric scarcity to a situation of caloric abundance. And it's used to give people so-called advice, and especially target people who want to lose weight or who want to want to avoid becoming overweight. Now, this is also a very sad and ironic example of a fact that travels and completely transforms as it travels, or a fact that's also a value, because enough is a value, as you can see, that completely transforms. Because what do? If the fact travels and the advice travels, it's not just a fact that travels, it's a practice that travels. So this laboratory, and I here sort of iconize it a bit, where there is the man around the table and the technician who says how much food they can get. That is the practice under which the 2,000 or 2,500 calories were established. Now, if they advise you and me or kind of other people to limit themselves, what they ask of us is that everybody plays their own laboratory technician. And these sort of very disappointed or sad or angry man, in the circumstances in the secluded hotel, this technician could always say, well, you can step out of the research, yeah, you can go to prison, and that's fine by me. So we have to be both these figures. We have to be the laboratory technician and the hungry man. And that is not a fact that travels, that is a specific behavioral technique that travels, in which you are supposed to behave as your own laboratory technician while you have to silence your own angry man. And that technique has all kind of behavioral consequences, and Elsa especially worked with professionals who are trying to change that and who work against that, who point out that counting calories tends to block satisfaction because you're counting calories rather than enjoying the food. It also orchestrates guilt because you never keep to what you count. So people say, in the Netherlands, they say if they eat more, I sinned. So you have this whole Protestant baggage coming in. And it also hides other hungers because people who overeat, if they get together and talk about it, and it tends to be, not always, but it tends to be involved with all kind of hungers they're feeding through food, as the metaphor is, rather than through other practices. The classic one is hunger for love, but it could be all kind of other things that people might be able to work on or not, but that are certainly hidden by counting calories. So what travels with the enough is that a normative laboratory fact, so I call here normative fact, and this is in medicine these words exist, a normative fact, it's good to remember that, normative fact. So the normative fact of enough to eat is not a fact in and of itself, it depends on social material practice, that of the laboratory, that we can all have in our pockets, there is an app for it. And what generalizes is never just the fact, but also the laboratory practice. And in this case, it interferes with other modes of eating. Example number 4 is from research just started, and here the hard work has been done by Agnes, who is there. So you can talk with him about further. They want you to stand up and wait. Good. So he's done work in Amsterdam about clean public spaces in Amsterdam. Now, this is a step away from hospital practice into the sort of, whatever you call it, the cleanliness or the health or the goodness or the valuing of city space. Now, the classic value in cleaning cities was hygiene, and this is a 19th century quest against cholera and etc. and so on to have cities cleaned to fight diseases. So there is still this healthcare twist. Now, what you see in places like the Netherlands, where the hygiene is in the public space is no longer the first urgent problem, precisely because it has been tamed, is that other goals emerge, and one of the goals is that citizens would be happy. And in Amsterdam 15, 20 years ago, if people would ask what the biggest complaint about the city was, it was dog shit. Now this is a photo of horse shit, of somebody who put that on the web and say, now the dog shit is solved, look what we have. Good, because the dog owners are now, they have to pick up, they have to carry their plastic bag and pick up whatever the dogs do on the street, which is a great improvement, but good. So one of the public space goals is now to keep citizens contented, or happy, good, not happy, contented. What is interesting and why I give this case is that this whole question of valuing, as I put it, rather than wondering about value, wondering about valuing practices, is that we found, or Agnes found, that our informants, the people he interviewed, are asking that question too. So just like I said, it's never just, if you believe you're the avant-garde, it's usually not the case. So here the question, what do people value, or what is valued in practice, is asked by those who are responsible for city cleaning. Because they want to know, they want to keep citizens contented, so they want to know how citizens value. Now, in order to answer that question, what is important about cleanliness for people in the city, they invented this kind of drawings. There are 2 free online, and the rest is in a very expensive book. It's so expensive, I didn't even buy it. It's not a good researcher attitude. I might if we push that particular topic. But what you can see here is A+, A, B, C, and D. It's the American grading system. And it's different kind of grading of, I don't know how clear it is from a distance, but you see more and more litter on the lawn. And that was meant to find out, to discuss with people in focus groups and all the rest of it, because these people are our students, and then they go on to that kind of jobs. They discuss what people value or not. Now, this interesting tool then traveled. We're talking all the time of traveling tools. And why did it travel? Well, one of the things is that cleaning, having a clean city, is a responsibility of the city, but in neoliberal times, all kinds of things that were state tasks get done by private companies. So cleaning is not in every city, and it's different, etc. and so on, but in quite a few cities in the Netherlands, cleaning is done by private companies. But then the private company has to be controlled. It has to be negotiated. So what has happened is that a certain level of cleanliness is negotiated between the policymakers of the city and the company. And how do they do it? With this same tool. And then once they have agreed that it will be kept at B level or at A level, somebody of the city can go around on the motorbike or on the bike or with a car and to make photos and to control and to tell the contractors if it's not clean enough, it's not clean enough. So the tool that was invented in one context shifts to another and the citizens disappear. But I didn't invent that, neither did Ignace, our informants told us this. So they are looking, they have still their questions, what do citizens value? Because they take it to be their task to make citizens happy. Now, they found a few very interesting things that I think are interesting for the rest of us. One of the things they told us, or one of them told us, is that if citizens were interviewed in their house about the cleanliness of the city, they tend to be negative. And he said, well, they remember the dog shit of 3 months ago, so they're negative. But if they were taken out in the street and asked, look around you, you think this is clean enough? Usually they would say, yeah, it's just fine. Because so where somebody gets interviewed makes a difference for the value. Now, this is not just clever of them, it's a lesson for all of us, and it fits really nice with the here or there. So the where of the value in this literal sense matters. What was also we really liked as a fact is that people might be happy with cleanliness, but oftentimes they were more happy if they saw people clean. So if the cleaning would be done with machines and man riding big machines in the night, people were okay. But if there was some person with a broom, like here, who's doing the cleaning during the day, they saw that the municipality cared. And that was what really valued them. So this is also important, that what is being valued may be different from here to there. So in relation to hygiene, what may be valued is sort of kind of what you could call the objective cleanliness, but what may matter more for citizen satisfaction is the whole investment and the whole showing of care. This may be true or not be true, this is what the informant said us. I mean, my point is not whether it's true, but it's an interesting point for thinking about valuing practices, that in this kind of valuing practice you happen to study, the question what is being valued, the people you work with don't necessarily have the same idea about what should be valued, and you're right. Good, I'm wrapping up. So, amongst ourselves, we have many cases of valuing these conferences, and there are also many questions to ask, and I don't want to push you out of the question at all, but I do think that an added question to always wonder is where the repertoires of valuing that you encounter in the field come from, and where did it travel? So to ask where questions. And at the same time, I have an argument as well. This is not just a descriptive game, and my argument is for specificity. By the way, it's very interesting. In Dutch, we have an expression, you should not compare apples with pears, which in English is you should not compare apples with oranges. And I sort of like this picture I came across. Good. And I'll summarize very quickly the cost, what I see to be the cost of generalizing. So the first I had is that with quantifying quality of life, you stabilize what counts and silence subjects. When independence gets turned from an indicator of a person into a parameter of successful treatment, adaptability diminishes, and what is fostered is proving, not improving. With calorie counting, when that turns into an advice to people, what you get is that laboratory techniques are important into daily lives and all kind of hungers get hidden. And using a tool to figure out how the hang-ups of citizens, if that's used for contract regulation, that is fine, that offers a managerial solution, but it doesn't offer citizen satisfaction. So the added value of signaling these concerns, as I said, is not facting, although I'm facting, but it's also valuing. And I may shape my valuing as criticism, but I think that all these cases that I've gone through are rather tragic than bad. So I'm rather inclined to see this kind of articulating of the problems as a kind of contribution to this field, as things I can give back in a form of care. Because in some fields, many of us encounter things that are bad, so this is where doing criticism is good. In these kind of fields, the kind of practices involved in most of these shifts were well meant by people who were trying to do good, but they have sort of adverse effects. So good, let's point it out. It's part of the common work. It's shared work in that sense. And the other caveat I want to make is that if I argue for specificity, that is not some kind of empiricist idea that things could be totally located. Now I'll show you a photo. I give the PhD methods class, and of course I sort of use the students to do fun things that I like as well. And one of the assignments I had in the last class is that people go out in the city and make photos of clean and non-clean places in the city. I thought then, it's fun, then I get new materials. And Roos Hopman had this picture, and the other assignment was that they would give two interpretations of the same picture. And she had this nice first story where she said, here we see messy weeds, and then this second story where she said, this is lovely, lively dandelions in the city. So these are two repertoires of assessing this kind of situation, where one is assessing it negatively in terms of weeds grown, and the other in terms of the wonders of having life managing to live even in the pavements of the city. And I want to introduce this example to see that if you're local, that doesn't mean you're local. It doesn't mean that the local is obvious. The local doesn't explain itself in its own terms. You always get terms that have traveled from elsewhere. So if my where question sort of encouragement is not you just be local and then it's evident, no. In every locality, the question is where you get imports from, which repertoires to use. And the whole point of asking the where question is not to stay isolated, but to have attention for these travelers and to attend to the traveling and to keep asking where questions. So what I'm arguing for is with a wing to the situated knowledge of Donna Haraway of 20 years ago, was it? Yeah, to have situated value as well. And my argument for specificity is not against traveling, but a call to ask where questions. And to summarize the talk is that it might be good in the various cases that we study to wonder that, to realize that what is at stake there, that to always wonder what is at stake there, where a value and technique comes from, and what it might affect here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. It was a brilliant talk. We've got a half an hour for questions and comments, and I believe Janelle will be running around with a microphone to come to you. So any questions? Anyone wish to start?
Hi, Gerard Verschoor from Wageningen University. I like your talk very much, I like your work very much. I remember in some of your writings on ontological politics, you wrote, like, okay, this is interesting because the question of the politics of who is shifted to the question of the politics of what. Now you're working on another question, the politics of where, but I didn't hear you elaborate on the politics of where.
No.
Perhaps you want to elaborate on it, or, I mean, of course it's implicit.
I'm not very into consistency, I mean, how to say that? In some context, in the context of the politics, for those of you who haven't read that stuff, it's what struck me at a certain moment is that if we did politics, the main question is always who gets to talk. So it's, do women get a say? Now, I'm all in favor of women getting a say, but that's not enough. So what I try to introduce, along with others at the same moment again, is to say what is made of woman. And that is the shift from, rather than do women get a say, is what is made of woman, is a shift from rather than attending to who, we're attending what. And it's not an either or, of course. It's sort of having these two kinds of thoughts. So that was a question of politics. What I'm doing here is actually, this talk is indeed about asking where questions. Now, what would the word politics add? I don't know. I don't see the added virtue of the call is for attending to where questions and attending to where things comes from and how they travel. And of course, you could see that you could do a politics of where if you wanted to, and if you want to point out that what we have at this moment, there will be other research. What happens quite often is that things travel from laboratories to practices rather than the other way around. And that I could write an article if I felt inclined and had the time to argue for questions traveling from the clinic to the lab rather than facts traveling from the lab to the clinic. That would be a politics of that, but that's not what I've been doing now. There's one here.
Thanks, Annemarie. Towards the end you mentioned that certain fields have more bad and they probably need more criticism, but you speak of some of these cases as spaces that need more care. But I was wondering if you could elaborate that, because the word care itself needs some amount of wearing and watting and all of that, and whether that actually plays out in the same way everywhere else. And actually care might be also something that you may want to do in bad places, and you may also want to do a more sort of violent care as a practice of care. So what do you feel about that?
I feel you're totally right. No, the problem is more, let's say, if they wanted to build a nuclear power station next to here or make an armament base for nuclear weapons, I might be inclined to think that criticism would be a relevant mode of relating also in academic ways. While I think that the kind of practices that I've, because how to say that, the dangers that come with that might deserve critique as a genre. And what I wanted to flag up is that, so this is not geographical, that in some places critique is warranted and not others. It has to do with the kind of problem at stake. So where, let's be very clear to geographers especially, where doesn't necessarily mean where on earth. It can mean the clinic or the lab, or it can mean this kind of, let's say, knowledge spaces, the clinic or the lab. And that the clinic or the lab, let's say, between different geographical places, labs are relatively similar because that's how labs are made to be. With this whole illusion that science would be universal, comes a lot of effort to making labs similar in different places, even if it's difficult. While clinics differ more because they come from a longer tradition of how people live. So my idea that criticism is necessary, or is a sort of, how to say this, relevant repertoire in some sites, doesn't mean in some geographical locations, but in relation to some problems. And you're also totally right that care you can unpack that big time. And it's, with Jeanette Pauls and Ingrid Moser, we edited a book on care in practice. And one of the articles that is relevant in relation to your question, John Law wrote an article there about the foot and mouth disease. In 2001 in Britain, in the UK, they have this foot and mouth disease, which is a very complex story in itself, because in some countries in the world, foot and mouth is endemic, and in places where it's not vaccinated against, etc. and so on. But anyway, part of the way of eradicating foot and mouth, or stopping it, was killing cattle. So that was a moment when killing was done as care. And you can unpack that, but in the moment of the vet killing the animals, the vet was considering what he was doing as a man that John was following, was considering that as care, but not care for the animal, but for the animal population. So whether something is violent or not is not always obvious. And of course, that comes in very many layers, because at that moment that was killed, that was caring for the herd, for the population, while 2 steps earlier you could critique the fact that that was necessary to do, because if they had all been vaccinated, they wouldn't, etc. and so on. So yes, what is care and isn't care is to be analysed and unpacked, again, in situated ways. Yeah?
Thanks again, Professor Mol, for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. My question it tries to shift also value a little bit. It seems to me, if I understood correctly, you, by asking where questions, you also wanted to us to focus specifically on how to understand particular localities or specificities, and see how things travel, to see how practices or things work out locally or in relation to specific practices, etc. But another type of value, of course, perhaps more from a Marxian point of view, the idea of surplus value and where value goes towards, or value extracted, and where value travels next. Right? And obviously, one of the things in the conference we're also discussing is inequalities and those kind of things. So I wonder whether is that like a mirror image of your talk, or is that a different concern altogether? How would you think about surplus value in relation to what you've talked about?
Well, obviously, I didn't think of surplus value, because I would have given another talk had I thought about surplus value. But this is sort of a language a problem where the word is the same, but the concern is different. And in relation to, if I would never talk, even if I would study the kind of economic practices, I'm not a Marxist and I wouldn't use the word surplus value. I would read with pleasure what you write about that, but if I would be doing the research, I would rather be interested in what kind of things are being valued and in which kind of mode. So you have valuing through pricing, you have valuing, so giving worth to labor, or giving worth to working hours, or giving worth to intentions, or giving worth to an object, or giving worth to the way it can be sold. So how to say it? I can see where surplus value comes from if you're making economic calculation, and it's just fine. I mean, I don't want to change that. I'm not, how to say that? I don't want to change everybody's practices in the same way. We shouldn't all talk the same language. But it's also important to keep that separate. I don't think for me, in my research, there would not be such a thing as the value. I would wonder how that gets valued, and how it gets valued in a monetary way, and how the classic examples, how it is that, let's say, poison produced in the kind of agriculture, or let's say pollution produced in the non-organic agriculture, is not taken up in price, but paid by the collective, while if you have organic agriculture, I do pay for the fact that it's not dirty. So that kind of thing I would really be interested in studying, but that wouldn't be through, do they have a value or not, but how are these appreciations made, and how are they put into, let's say, how's monetary valuing done in relation to, in this case, ecological value?
Very short follow-up question. How would you then, talk to, I mean, perhaps not talk to people, but acknowledge many of us who have a certain concern for rising inequalities or those kind of things, right? Whereby, to me at least.
I'm glad you do, because I think that's the distribution of labor that should be attended to. But how to say that? Again, inequalities are very complex things, because when they are for a researcher, I mean, it's different in different settings, but when when they are recognized as inequalities, when they are not recognized. If you have a system where men get paid for their wage labor and women do not get paid for household labor, that is an enormous inequality. And is that one you study or not? Or do you study one between, let's say, what the top of a company earns and what the bottom earns, and which kind of, so I would be always there as a researcher, not necessarily as a voter, so I would be interested in the kind of things that get counted as inequalities, and what effects that has. Yeah.
Thank you for this is working. Okay, great. Thank you for a lovely talk, and it made me think of the where question in terms of valuation. Made me think of a recent, or not a recent movie, but a movie that I watched recently, which was a documentary describing a struggle of a Native American community against upstream pollution from the tar sands exploitation and the incredible toxicity that came with that. And in relation to that, it made me think of a couple of things. You were talking about value and awareness and visibility and non-visibility. And I remembered a screenshot of the Native Americans fishing and the fish having tumors. And it made me think about visibility being performed in many different ways. But then, in order to make her claims stronger, more authoritative, and more powerful, what this community ultimately started practicing were laboratorized, measurement-based ways of noticing this toxicity, measuring it, monitoring it, etc. So in relation to the value of awareness, some places, and this is obviously old Latour's, not old Latour's, but Latour's old argument about laboratorization and the fact that the politics of the awareness becomes important because certain places reproduce themselves, if you like.
Well, you could do that through places. You could also say certain techniques of value have more social power or political power in certain kind of institutions.
That's because these institutions become part of other places.
Sure. So thanks for the addition. This is a good example of the fact that there are different valuing techniques that don't speak equally loud. If I walk to a city and I say I feel bad here, it's not very strong. It may be very strong for me, but it's not very strong political argument. And indeed, if you show a lab measurement that says this, I didn't feel well because there's this toxin, that it's not necessarily going to work either, especially for Native Americans in the current government of the US. But at least it can have more social power. Yeah. So this is another question I didn't, again, of course, my talk is not covering everything. I did completely not address that. Which kind of modes of valuing speak to which audiences, speak to which practices, or speak in which institutions. But that is something to unpack in and of itself. So thanks for that addition.
Before I give up my microphone, I'd like to just share an observation in relation to value and communitarianism and being in things together and interdependence. It has struck me that female speakers acknowledge communities, intellectual communities, much more than male speakers at this conference. So I would encourage male speakers to show wherever tentacles are reaching and where we're coming from. Well, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I could see so many points of reference between our two talks, so that was great to hear. And I'm interested in the comment you made at the end that, in a way, all the things that you looked at started out as being trying to do good and then moved to adverse effects. And I'm interested in that movement, and whether we could imagine things that started out to do bad and then that have caring effects,
Very nice.
But because it seems like it fits, well, I don't know, what do you think? In a way, what happens in each of the movements that you talk about the subject gets lost somehow, the citizen gets lost, the cancer patient's needs get lost, the person who wants to get back working, and that they're all kind of, in a sense, sort of individuals that get lost in some ways. I don't know, and then the move seems to be towards some kind of normalization or standardization that would go along with a kind of governmentality argument. You know, that somehow, I don't know, I mean, I think you're kind of working against that, but to some extent the directionality and the ways that things become then formalized seem to work within some kind of vision of a more state-centered vision of the good or controlling vision of the good. So I'm interested in wondering how we might think through these kind of moves, because it's very productive to think this way, but to think either in terms of the opposite, like something that starts off bad that ends up having a caring effect, or something that stands out to do good but moves to do better, you know? And whether we could think of examples like that, just to counter the directionality of the four cases, which I found really stimulating.
Wonderful, thank you for that question. I have 3 remarks. The first is that it's good that you point out that it seems that I'm countering the individual versus the state-like things. Well, I'm rather romantic and it's not about the individual, but it's about lived daily life. So it's about what in medicine would be the clinic versus the lab. So it's about what I'm defending in a sort of sub-way, what gets squeezed each time. It's lived daily practices against indeed metrizations or laboratory practices. But that is not to see that laboratory practices are always bad. So, I mean, this is a way a care-control type of dichotomy, but I've written earlier about how control practices can do care. Or can be intermittent. Because if you, for instance, have blood sugar measurement for people with diabetes 1, that is a laboratory technique that they can use on themselves. For one, you can learn to feel your own blood sugar measurement better, partly through measuring, and each time trying to assess your own felt reality against the measurement. This is one of the better techniques to become a feeling body can be measuring, not in all cases, but in that case. So in specificities, these relations are far more complex. So that's the first one. The second, about the governmentality thing, I hate the work on governmentality, and in my guts. And one of the reasons I hate it is that it's generalized. What you do is you look at any practice and you say governmentality, discipline, no, because it is really not differentiating. Like, say, the work I did with Elsa Vogel on the eating enough. When Elsa I had been doing some critique of the traditional Dutch dieting system. So she had gone out to do all kind of work with people who try to work in different ways. And what she tells us that each time she explains that work of these people who painstakingly try to not discipline but do all kind of other cares. Somebody in the audience says, "Oh, you're talking about real bad governmentality and normalization." So what it does is kill the possibility to differentiate. So I'm not talking about governmentality, I just don't use the word. It's also a way of avoiding to even engage with it. I try to think elsewhere. Now, about what I like most in your question is the idea that bad things can have good effects. And in a way, what I've thought about, given this audience, is that we make a competition of somebody who can get the best example of a bad that turns into a good. I mean, there must be, not to have a competition, but just that there must be cases out there where I can't immediately think of a good example, but it would in itself be a great research strategy, also because just like we all are concerned with inequality, there is a certain measure to which, as this kind of crowd, myself included, of course, we like to study bads, and you are one of the people who have insisted that we study goods. So this would be a really good way of studying goods. So if somebody has an example of a bad that turned into a good, yes, send it to both Catherine and me. We'll see what we do. We can collectively do it. By the way, of course, of the good, we can also be suspicious, if you want, as always. I earlier worked with another student on good tomatoes, and we took good tomatoes to unpack what the qualification of tomatoes, so when and how do tomatoes get qualified or valued as good. And one of the things we came across is that a certain company, Heinz tomato ketchup, they do great work for their tomatoes, and but they claim, of course, that they're growing goods, and they have this advertisement, growing goods, because you have this whole, English is, by the way, fantastic. The fact that goods is both a positive term and something you sell on the market is, I find, stunning. But by the way, it's the same in Dutch, so I shouldn't complain about English. But it can't be the same in every language, it's ridiculous. So, so there is this overlayer of what good is. So that example wouldn't count. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jens. I'm from the University of Copenhagen. I have a question regarding the relation between situatedness, specificity, and traveling. When I listened to your talk, I was reminded by David Moss, who talks about how to travel, knowledge must become disembedded, so it cannot remain situated if it is to travel. And you say you have an argument for specificity, but you're not against traveling. So I wonder, how do you think about that trade-off between situatedness and traveling? And do you have any examples of situated knowledge that can travel?
Oh, good point, because what you disentangle here is the traveling of knowledge and the traveling of repertoires of speaking. As we talk, we have all kinds of imports. There's traveling all the time. Already when I say the word import, you get all the economically trained geographers here thinking about things traveling across country borders. So that is with the word import, we import the idea of import and export. Huh? So I think it's important to recognize that you cannot clean the language from that kind of thing. So that's one of the things English is problematic. The fact that we all talk English is problematic because in other languages you have other resonances. So with the English language, again, nothing against English language, you have with each word you have other things that are done with that word or that attach to that. And that is not, so in that sense I'm not against traveling, as there would be a total illusion that you could do without that. So what I'm arguing for is to attend to that and to wonder, okay, if the word import comes with import-export, might I invent another word that has other baggage? Or is that okay here, or doesn't it matter so much, or can I move on? And one of the things that in my team we often fight is that you cannot unpack every word, but it might sometimes help for the central word in a specific project to be very careful. Or for instance, to use, there's Carolina there, she works in Peru. So for the central term in a particular research, she would use the Spanish word. And then not presume, because that would be a word from Madrid. So then it would be to attend what it means in her village. And you cannot do what your word means in your village for every word, because then you get crazy, you cannot write. But that's the kind of specificity thing that I would argue for, and not against travel. Yep. And situated knowledge is, of course, how to say that? David Moss has this good Latourian argument that you have some knowledge to travel, you disembed. It's also what I do. If I give you in 2 slides a summary of an article that I wrote 20 years ago with 2 or 15 years ago, it doesn't matter, with 2 others, it gets disembedded as well. So there is embedding and disembedding going on all the time. Again, the problem is not that, the problem is not attending to it. And the problem is what to care for the kind of travel that we do. How to say that? It would be absolutely ridiculous to have a kind of fantasy of localism as if there was such a thing. There is no empirical without language, and there is no local without travel. If you would have a society which is or a place where there is no traveling, which is no longer possible given that the polluted air is traveling anyway. But anyway, if you would have that the classic ethnographic stories of people who don't travel is that they think they're the whole world, which is fine, but you and I cannot have that illusion.
Thank you. It's more of a comment, which I generally hate to do, but I guess because we've been raising this question about bad studying to good. I wondered, one of the sort of arguments in favor of capitalism, which
Of what?
in favor of capitalism,
Yes.
which I disagree with. But Bernard de Mandeville, Dutch doctor, Adam Smith, moral philosopher from Scotland, they're both saying that actually you need to be selfish and you need to be bad, but on a general social level, this has a positive effect. Which makes me think about, your, I think, absolutely correct statement. It's like, well, who gets to evaluate the good and determine the same object to be either positive or negative, which might sort of tie into this question of social inequality. Anyway, so that's just to throw that out there. For
Of course, the good and the bad are not objective realities. Hey, yes, but that's good to point out. Totally.
We have time for one final question.
Yeah, there's one.
Sorry, but could
Yeah,
you
you can take your chance. Nobody else asked. You can ask a second one.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain then what you meant when you in the context of what you've just responded to about specificity, travel, situativeness, what did you then mean when you said words don't act, things don't act, people don't act, and it's only networks that get things done? Maybe.
Oh, yes, sorry, that was a bit a quickie. No, what I'm concerned about many things, but this is not my biggest concern. But in the context where we are, this is a serious concern. I'm sort of concerned what happened with the word act, because in English, this word act has this baggage of classic liberalism. So there is, what is attached to it is an opposition between causality and action. So on the one hand, there are some things being caused, and on the other hand, you have the free actor. Now, what happened in the 80s in order to disturb that dichotomy, our friends Bruno Latour and Michel Carlon started to play with that. It was meant to disturb that dichotomy. So they said the kind of things that are now attributed to humans, ha ha ha, doors do them too, or door closes, or... So it was meant to disturb the dichotomy. What I see happening is that rather than that, the way that's presently taking up, it's not so much disturbing the dichotomy, but closing down the causality bit, no causality, and dreaming up the liberal actor. And then everything acts, but the kind of the theory of action that is mobilized in talking about that action is a very traditional liberal theory of action. So one of the reasons I say things don't act, but people don't act either, is not to say just networks act, is to say let's be very careful with this liberal legacy of what action would be. And one of the things we have, that was an article that Megan was so kind to allude to, where we tried to tackle that head on. For geographers, so I should be happy. So it's called Living with Omega-3. It's with 4 authors. And what we show there is that it's a bit not nice of us. We take on the case of Omega-3 because Jane Bennett uses in her Vibrant Matter book that as an example. She says Omega-3 acts. And we say, well, wait a minute. And we go into the article that she used to say that, the article she quoted, and we show that to begin with, that article is not about action, but about causality. And that actually was a very interesting article because it was a good article, because it was trying to argue for better food in prisons. And it was not just about omega-3, but it was also about vitamins. So as soon as you go into the details, that is very different. And then we have a section about, well, where does the omega-3 come from? And then Sebastian Abramson was part of the author team, looked into the pills that are sold in Sweden and Norway, and they have omega-3 that comes out of fishing in Africa in the West Coast. So wait a minute, for omega-3 to act, you get local people pushed out of their livelihoods, and etc. and so on. So isolating an object as acting while there is this complex inequality going on, it might not be so good idea. And then we have a sort of philosophy section where we say, in what kind of registers can we talk about doing? So acting is one, but if you take, for instance, eating as a metaphor for doing rather, so the actorship metaphor of doing, if you would historically trace that, the liberal actor is a muscular actor, it's a fighting man. It's about throwing a spear, that's the image of an action in the Western tradition. And if you take digestion already as doing something, you have doing something, but you have no control, or not in the same way. You can try to sort of foster your digestion, but you cannot control your question in the same way that you convert to control, throw, and spear. So what we come up with is other metaphors for doing to push ourselves out of that liberal lingo that is, much to my sadness, sort of coming back through the voice of all kind of great people who want to attend to objects and to things and to animals and plants. By all means, attend to what animals and plants do, but don't have them be little Lockean or sort of liberal actors. Invent other language for what your things do. Let's say plants grow. Is that acting? Or plants smell? So one of the things to do is to, again, dare to do specificity. There are so many more verbs. Let's not all use the same words. Let's go in the field and see what kind of verbs are interesting here, which words can I play with. So thank you for that last question that allowed me to get out one of my kind of sessions. And thank you all very much, and I look forward to the talks I will be able to attend to.
Please join me in thanking you.